Some wounds never heal, and some secrets never die. Jake Dunley learned this the hard way when he was just 12 years old. Found unconscious outside an abandoned mine in Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, with a strange mark burned into his left leg for 30 years. That wound stayed exactly the same. It never bled, never hurt, never got better or worse. The town doctor said it was scar tissue. The older folks whispered about curses and bad omens. Jake just wanted to forget about it and live his life. But now Jake is back home to bury his father and settle the family ranch. And for the first time in 3 decades, the wound is changing. Dark lines are spreading from it like spider webs under his skin. The pain is getting worse each day. The townspeople won't look him in the eye anymore. Jake is about to learn that some wounds aren't just scars, they're warnings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The gravel crunched under Jake Dunley's boots as he stepped out of his dusty pickup truck and faced the ranch house he hadn't seen in 24 years. The 2-story farmhouse stood weathered but sturdy against the Wyoming sky, its white paint peeling in places like old skin. Behind it, the Bighorn Mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks still touched with snow despite the late spring. Warmth. Jake pulled his worn Stetson lower over his eyes and limped toward the front porch. The wound on his left leg throbbed with each step, a sensation so foreign after 3 decades of numbness that it made him pause halfway up the walkway. He rolled up his jeans and stared at the mark that had defined his childhood. The pale, circular scar was no longer the smooth, coin-sized disc he remembered. Dark veins now spread outward from its edges, like the roots of some terrible plant, reaching toward his knee with tendrils that pulsed faintly beneath his skin. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, running his fingers over the changed flesh. 4. The first time since he was 12, the wound felt warm to the touch. The memories came flooding back as he climbed the porch steps. He was 8 years old again, racing through these same fields with his best friend Tommy Briggs, building forts in the hay barn, learning to rope cattle under his father's patient guidance. Those had been good years. Before the accident that changed everything, Jake pushed open the front door. His father had never locked it. Even after Jake left and stepped into the familiar scent of coffee, leather, and old wood, dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the living room windows. Everything looked smaller than he remembered, but essentially unchanged. His father's recliner still sat angled toward the television, a folded newspaper on the side table, as if Robert Dunley might walk in at any moment to finish reading it. But Robert Dunley would never read another paper. "Heart attack," the doctor had said, sudden and massive. By the time the neighbor found him 3 days later, it was far too late. Jake had driven straight through from Montana, where he'd been working a ranch outside Billings, to arrive just in time for the funeral arrangements. The wound throbbed again, and Jake sank into his father's chair, closing his eyes against the wave of grief and something that felt almost like guilt. He should have come home sooner, should have called more often, should have made peace with the man who raised him before it was too late. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. Jake opened it to find a petite Asian woman in her 40s, wearing scrubs and carrying a medical bag. "You must be Jake," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chun. I was your father's physician, and I treated you briefly when you were young. I'm sorry for your loss." Jake shook her hand, noting her firm grip and direct gaze. "Thank you. Dad spoke highly of you in his letters. May I come in? I wanted to check on you, and there are some things about your father's final months that I think you should know." Jake stepped aside, gesturing her toward the living room. Dr. Chun settled on the couch across from him, her expression serious. "Your father was worried about you coming back," she said without preamble. Not because he didn't want to see you, he talked about you constantly, but because of what happened to you here as a child. The accident at the mine, Jake said. I remember some of it. Do you remember being found 3 days after you disappeared? Do you remember the condition you were in? Jake frowned. The memories of that time were hazy, fragmented. I remember waking up in the hospital. You said I had been unconscious. You were more than unconscious, Jake. You were in a catatonic state. Your body temperature was dangerously low, and you had that mark on your leg, a burn that defied medical explanation. No known heat source could have created that pattern. And when you finally woke up, you spoke about things. She paused. Things that frightened your father deeply. The wound pulsed, and Jake winced. Dr. Chen's eyes immediately went to his leg. It's changing, isn't it? She said quietly. Jake nodded, rolling up his jeans to show her. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her medical training overriding any fear as she examined the spreading dark lines. This is impossible, she murmured. Scar tissue doesn't behave this way. And the pattern, it's almost like a circulatory system. It's been hurting since I crossed the county line, Jake admitted. For 30 years, nothing. Now it's like something's waking up inside it. Double quotes. Dr. Chen sat back, her face pale. Your father made me promise to give you something if you ever came back. She reached into her medical bag and pulled out a worn leather. Journal, its cover cracked with age. He said you'd need to understand the truth about what happened to you and about your family's history in this town. Jake took the journal, feeling its weight in his hands. His father's name was embossed on the cover in faded gold letters. What truth? Read it, Dr. Chen said, standing. But Jake, whatever you learn, remember that your father loved you more than his own life. Everything he did was to protect you. After she left, Jake sat alone in the gathering dusk, his father's journal in his lap. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the yard. The wound continued its steady throb, a metronome counting down to something he couldn't yet understand. He opened the journal to the first page and began to read his father's careful handwriting. If Jake is reading this, then the worst has happened and I am gone. Son, what I'm about to tell you will be hard to believe, but every word is true. The accident at the McAllister mine when you were 12 wasn't an accident at all, and the mark on your leg isn't a burn. It's something much older and far more dangerous than you could ever imagine. Jake's hands trembled as he turned the page. The wound seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, as if it too was eager to learn the secrets that had been hidden for so long. The mine has been closed for 60 years, but it was never empty. Something lives in those tunnels, something that has been waiting for a very long time. And Jake, I'm afraid it's been waiting for you. A sound outside made Jake look up from the journal. Through the living room window, he could see a figure standing at the edge of the property, silhouetted against the darkening sky. As he watched, the figure raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a beckoning gesture. Jake stood, moving to the window for a better look, but the figure was gone. Only the empty field stretched toward the foothills where the abandoned McAllister mine sat like a dark wound in the earth. The journal felt heavier in his hands now, weighted with 30 years of secrets. But as the wound pulsed again, Jake knew he had no choice but to keep reading. Whatever was happening to him, whatever had been waiting all these years, the answers lay in his father's words, and somewhere in the distance carried on the Wyoming wind. He could swear he heard the faint sound of voices calling his name. Jake spent the night reading his father's journal by lamplight, the wound in his leg growing more painful with each revelation. By dawn, he understood that his father had been living with terrible knowledge for 3 decades, and that knowledge was now his burden to bear. The journal spoke of old mining companies, stranger disappearances, and rituals performed in the depths of the earth. But the entries were cryptic, filled with references Jake didn't understand and names he'd never heard. He needed more information, and he knew exactly where to find it. The Cedar Ridge Public Library sat on Main Street like a fortress of red. Brick and tall windows, unchanged, Jake's childhood. As he climbed the front steps, the wound pulsed with each movement, sending tendrils of pain up his thigh. He paused at the entrance, steadying himself against the handrail. Jake Dunley. As I live and breathe. He turned to see a woman in her 70s approaching from the street. Martha Kellaway had been the town librarian for as long as anyone could remember. Her silver hair always perfectly arranged, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime organizing. "Knowledge, Mrs. Kellaway," Jake said, tipping his hat. "Good to see you again. Is it now?" Her smile was warm but guarded. "I heard you were back for your father's funeral. I'm sorry for your loss, dear. Robert was a good man. Thank you. I was hoping to do some research on the old mining operations around here for the family history." Martha's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. "The McAllister mine, you mean?" "Among others." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded toward the library entrance. "Come along, then. I suppose it's time you learned the whole truth." The library's interior smelled of old books and furniture polish, exactly as Jake remembered. Martha led him past the circulation desk to a restricted section he'd never been allowed to enter as a child. She unlocked a glass-fronted cabinet and withdrew several thick folders. "These are the mining company records from the 1920s and 1930s, she said, setting them on a nearby table. "Most people don't know they exist, and I've kept it that way for good reason." Jake opened the first folder and found himself looking at corporate documents from McAllister Mining and Excavation Company. The letterhead was ornate, old-fashioned, but the contents made his blood run cold. "Geological survey reports," he read aloud. "But these aren't about mineral deposits. They're about something called dimensional instabilities and threshold manifestations." "Keep reading," Martha said quietly. The documents detailed a pattern of disappearances that began in 1932. 7 children had vanished near the mine over a period of 3 years, all between the ages of 10 and 14. The mining company's reports described these disappearances as necessary acquisitions for the Threshold project. "My God," Jake whispered. "They were taking children." The McAllister company wasn't just mining for copper and silver, Martha explained. They were conducting experiments trying to open doorways to places that should remain closed. They brought in consultants from back east, men who claimed to understand forces beyond normal science. Jake found a photograph in the next folder that made his hand shake. It showed a group of men in suits standing around what appeared to be a ritual circle carved into stone. At the center of the circle lay a child, a boy of perhaps 12 years old, unconscious or worse. "The project culminated in the summer of 1935, Martha continued. "They attempted what they called the Great Opening, a ceremony designed to create a permanent doorway. But something went wrong. There was an explosion deep in the mine. 17 men died, including all the company executives and their consultants. The mine was sealed, and the few survivors left town immediately." "What does this have to do with me?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew. Martha reached into the cabinet again and withdrew a single sheet of paper. "This is a list of the children who disappeared. Look at the last name." Jake's eyes scanned down the typewritten list until he found it. Timothy Dunley, age 12, disappeared July 15th, 1935. "My grandfather," Jake breathed. "Your grandfather was one of the children taken for their rituals. But unlike the others, he came back. 3 days after the mine explosion, he walked out of those tunnels alive, but changed. He carried a mark on his leg, exactly like yours." The wound pulsed violently, and Jake gripped the edge of the table. The mark passes down through generations? Not exactly. Your grandfather lived a normal life, married, had children. But Mark skipped your father's generation entirely. We thought it was over, that whatever curse had touched your family had finally died out. Martha's eyes were sad but determined. Then you were born, and when you turned 12, I was drawn. To the mine, Jake finished, just like he was. Your father and Sheriff Briggs found you there 3 days later, unconscious in the same chamber where the rituals had taken place. You had the mark, just like your grandfather. But you were alive, which was more than anyone dared hope for. Jake stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked Main Street. The normal bustle of a small town continued outside, people going about their daily lives, unaware of the darkness that lurked beneath their peaceful existence. There's more, isn't there? He said, without turning around. I'm afraid so. The mark isn't just a scar, Jake. It's a connection, a doorway that was never properly closed. And now that you're back, a sound from the restricted section made them both turn. The lights in the library flickered, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Jake's wound began to glow with a faint pulsing light visible even through his jeans. It's starting again, Martha whispered. Dear God, it's starting again. The fluorescent lights above them exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging the restricted section into near darkness. In the sudden gloom, Jake could see his wound clearly. The dark vein spreading from it now pulsed with an otherworldly luminescence, like blood flowing through alien arteries. And in that eerie light, he saw something that made his heart stop. Standing between the stacks of books, translucent and shimmering, was the figure of a child, a boy of about 12, wearing clothes from the 1930s, his eyes wide with terror and recognition. Grandfather? Jake whispered. The spectral boy opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, Jake heard a sound that seemed to emanate from the wound itself, a whisper that spoke directly into his mind. The door is opening. They're coming through. You have to stop them or join them. The apparition faded. The lights stopped flickering, and the library returned to normal. But Jake could still feel the presence, still hear the whisper echoing in his thoughts. Martha gathered the documents with shaking hands. You need to leave town, Jake. Tonight. Drive as far as you can and never come back. I can't, Jake said, and he realized with growing certainty that it was true. Something was calling to him, pulling him back toward the mine with an irresistible force. It won't let me leave. I can feel it in my mind, in my blood. Whatever they started 70 years ago, it's not finished. The wound pulsed again, stronger. Now, and with it came a flood of images, dark tunnels, ritual circles, and something vast and hungry stirring in the depths of the earth. Jake understood with crystalline clarity that he had a choice to make: flee and spend the rest of his life running from this curse, or stay and face whatever was awakening in the abandoned mine. As he limped out of the library, Martha's warnings echoing behind him, Jake made his decision. The boy in the vision had been right about one thing. He could either stop what was coming or become part of it. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was fighting. And that meant going back to where it all began, back to the McAllister mine, where his family's curse had taken root in the darkness below. Jake spent the rest of the day in his father's study, poring over the mining records Martha had reluctantly allowed him to photocopy. The wound continued its relentless pulsing, now so intense that he had to take breaks every few minutes to deal with the pain. But with each throb came something else, flashes of memory that weren't his own, glimpses of the mine as it had been in the 1930s. By evening, he couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. He drove to Martha's house, a Victorian cottage on Elm Street surrounded by gardens that had won county awards for 30 years running. She answered the door before he could knock, as if she'd been expecting him. "You look terrible," she said, ushering him into her parlor. "Sit down before you fall down." The room was filled with antique furniture and family photographs spanning generations. Martha brought him coffee and settled across from him in a wingback chair, her expression resigned. "You're not going to leave, are you?" she said. "I can't. Something's pulling me back to that mine, and it's getting stronger every hour." Jake leaned forward, fixing her with an intense stare. "Mrs. Calloway, I need you to tell me everything. Not just what you told me at the library. Everything you know about my family and that place." Martha was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the arm of her chair. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of hidden knowledge. "Your grandfather wasn't the first Dunley to be touched by what's in that mine," she began. "The connection goes back much further to your great-grandfather, Samuel Dunley, who owned the land before McAllister Mining ever arrived." She stood and moved to an old secretary desk, withdrawing a manila envelope from a locked drawer. "This came into my possession after your father's death. He made me promise to give it to you if you ever came back asking questions." Jake opened the envelope and found himself looking at a document unlike anything in the mining company records. It was handwritten on expensive paper, the ink faded but still legible. The header read, "Covenant and Pact between Samuel Dunley and McAllister Mining and Excavation Company, dated August 15th, 1932. A pact?" Jake read the first few lines aloud. "In consideration of services rendered and future obligations undertaken, the party of the first part agrees to grant access to designated portions of his land in perpetuity, with the understanding that such access serves a purpose beyond mere mineral extraction." "Keep reading," Martha said quietly. The language was archaic and formal, but the meaning became clear as Jake continued. Samuel Dunley had agreed to allow McAllister Mining to conduct their experiments on his land in exchange for protection during the Dust Bowl. Years' protection that went far beyond financial assistance. "They promised to shield his family from the worst of the droughts and dust storms," Jake said, looking up. "But in return, he agreed to provide." He stopped, the words sticking in his throat. "One child from each generation to serve as what they called an anchor," Martha finished. "A living connection between our world and whatever lies beyond." Jake felt sick. "My great-grandfather sold his descendants to these people. He was desperate. The Dust Bowl was destroying everything he'd worked for, and his wife was pregnant with their first child. The mining company claimed they could ensure his family's prosperity for generations, and they kept that promise. The Dunley Ranch survived when dozens of others failed. The wound pulsed, and with it came a flood of images. Samuel Dunley standing in a candlelit room, signing the document with hands that shook with fear and determination. The mining executives watching with satisfied smiles. And beneath it all, something vast and alien pressing against the boundaries of reality, waiting for its promise due. "But something went wrong with my grandfather," Jake said, understanding dawning. "He was supposed to disappear completely, wasn't he? Become a permanent bridge for whatever they were trying to bring through. The ceremony in 1935 was meant to complete the pact. Timothy, your grandfather, was to be the sacrifice that opened the door permanently. But when the mine exploded, the ritual was interrupted. He came back changed, but still human, still anchored to this world." Martha moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening streets. "We thought that meant the pact was broken, that your family was free. Timothy lived a normal life, married your grandmother, raised your father. The mark on his leg faded to almost nothing. We began to hope, until I was born. The mark reappeared when you turned 12, just as it had with Timothy. But by then, we understood more about what we were facing. Your father and Tom Briggs, he was just a deputy then. They'd been researching the mine, trying to understand what the McAllister people had really been doing down there. Jake found another document in the envelope, a hand-drawn map of the mine's lower levels, marked with symbols that made his eyes water to look at directly. They went into the mine? The night you disappeared, yes. They found you in the deepest chamber, lying in the center of what can only be described as a summoning circle. The mark was fresh on your leg, glowing like a brand. And there were things moving, in the shadows around you. Things that shouldn't exist in our world. The memory of that night was starting to come back to Jake in fragments. The overwhelming compulsion to go to the mine. The descent into darkness. The sound of voices calling his name from impossibly deep tunnels. And then I remember light. He said slowly, blinding light and a sensation of falling. But not down sideways, as if reality itself was tilting. Tom shot out the electric cables powering their equipment, Martha explained. Without the power source, the ritual circle went dormant, and whatever was trying to cross over was pulled back. But the damage was already done. The mark was already on you, the connection already established. Jake studied the map, noting the intricate network of tunnels that went far deeper than any copper mine had reason to go. These passages, they don't follow any geology, I know. It's like they were carved specifically for the rituals, because they were. The mining operation was just a cover. McAllister and his people spent 3 years hollowing out those chambers, following patterns dictated by their consultants. They were building a machine, Jake, a machine designed to thin the barriers between worlds. The wound suddenly flared with pain so intense that Jake doubled over, gasping. Through the agony, he heard voices, not the whisper from the library, but multiple voices speaking in unison, their words just at the edge of comprehension. It's getting stronger, Martha observed, her voice tight with worry. The closer you get to understanding the truth, the more active the connection becomes. Jake straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. Mrs. Kellaway, there's something else I need to know. In my father's journal, he mentioned that I spoke about things when I first woke up in the hospital. What kind of things? Martha's face went pale. You spoke in languages that didn't exist. You described places that had never been seen by human eyes, and you said, she paused, gathering courage. You said they were waiting for you to grow up, to reach full maturity. You said the mark would call you home when the time was right. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. I'm not 12 anymore. I'm 42 fully grown, just like they wanted. Which is why you can't stay here, Martha said urgently. Whatever they started all those years ago, they're preparing to finish it. And you're the key they've been waiting for. But even as she spoke, Jake knew it was too late for running. The wound wasn't just a mark anymore. It was a beacon, calling out across dimensions to things that had been patient for far too long. He could feel them stirring in the darkness beneath the town, responding to his presence like flowers turning toward the sun. The real question wasn't whether he could escape his family's legacy. The question was whether he could find a way to break the pact before it claimed not just him, but the entire town of Cedar Ridge. Jake left Martha's house with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. He needed to see the mine for himself. The pact document included a detailed map of the tunnels, and tucked into its folds was something that made his breath catch. An ornate skeleton key, its metal black with age and etched with symbols that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The next morning, despite every rational instinct screaming at him to leave town, Jake found himself driving toward the foothills where the McAllister mine waited. The wound had kept him awake most of the night, pulsing with increasing intensity, and now it seemed to pull him forward like a compass needle seeking magnetic north. The mine entrance sat in a narrow canyon, partially concealed by decades of overgrown scrub brush and the deliberate efforts of townspeople who wanted it forgotten. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded the site, but the lock had long since corroded away. Warning signs proclaimed the area unsafe, the mine flooded and unstable, but Jake could see that the signs were lies. The entrance wasn't flooded. It was sealed with concrete and steel, as if someone had been very determined to keep something inside. But the pack's map showed a secondary entrance, hidden among the rock formations higher up the canyon wall. Jake found it exactly where the document indicated, a narrow opening concealed behind a carefully arranged pile of stones. Someone had been maintaining this entrance, keeping it clear and accessible. The skeleton key fit perfectly into a hidden lock mechanism built into the rock face. As the tumblers clicked into place, Jake felt the wound in his leg flare with anticipation, as if it recognized this moment as significant. The concealed door swung open silently, revealing a tunnel that descended into darkness. Jake had brought a powerful flashlight, but as he stepped into the tunnel, he realized he barely needed it. The walls themselves seemed to emit a faint phosphorescent glow, just enough to see by. The tunnel was too perfectly round, too smooth, to have been carved by any conventional mining equipment. It spiraled downward in a gentle curve, following patterns that felt somehow organic. The deeper he went, the stronger the pull became. The wound was no longer just pulsing. It was singing, a low harmonic vibration that seemed to resonate in his bones. And with each step, memories that weren't his own began flooding his consciousness. He saw the tunnel as it had been in 1935, lit by electric bulbs filled with the sound of pickaxes and drilling equipment. But the workers weren't mining for copper. They were following pre-existing passages, widening them just enough for human passage. The tunnels had been here long before McAllister mining arrived, carved by forces that predated human civilization. After what felt like an hour of descent, Jake emerged into a vast underground chamber. His flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling, but the phosphorescent glow was stronger here, emanating from veins of some unknown mineral that ran through the rock like arteries. And at the center of the chamber, exactly as the map had indicated, was the ritual circle dot. It was larger than he had expected, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, carved directly into the stone floor with mathematical precision. The symbols around its perimeter seemed to writhe and shift in the strange light, and as Jake approached, he could feel them pulling at his consciousness, trying to draw him deeper into their meaning. But it was what lay at the center of the circle that made him stumble backward in shock. The skeleton key in his hand had opened more than just a tunnel entrance. It had unlocked a hidden chamber within the circle itself. A section of the floor had risen like a pedestal, revealing a collection of objects that shouldn't have existed. Photographs of missing children, arranged in chronological order. Personal belongings, a pocket watch, a doll, a child's Bible, each item carefully preserved and labeled. And at the center of the display, a leather-bound journal filled with detailed observations about each disappearance. Written in the same formal script as the packed document. Jake opened the journal with trembling hands and found himself reading the clinical notes of madmen. Each child's reaction to the ritual process was documented with scientific detachment. Their screams were described as vibrational frequencies that facilitate dimensional membrane weakening. Their terror was analyzed as emotional energy suitable for threshold expansion. But it was the final entry that made Jake's blood run cold. Subject 7, Timothy Dunley, displays unprecedented resistance to the transition process. Unlike previous subjects, who achieved complete dimensional displacement within 72 hours, Subject 7 maintains corporeal stability even after exposure to the full ritual sequence. Hypothesis: genetic factors may create natural anchors capable of surviving partial dimensional shift. Recommend immediate secondary ritual to complete the process. The entry was dated July 18th, 1935, 3 days after his grandfather's disappearance. The mine explosion had occurred on July 19th, interrupting the secondary ritual that would have completed his grandfather's transformation. Jake sank to his knees beside the circle, The full horror of his family's situation finally clear. His grandfather hadn't been a victim who escaped. He had been an experiment that succeeded beyond the researchers' wildest dreams. The mark wasn't a scar from a failed ritual. It was proof that the ritual had worked exactly as intended. The wound in his leg suddenly blazed with light, and Jake cried out as images flooded his mind. Not memories this time, but visions of the present. He could see through multiple sets of eyes simultaneously, the townspeople going about their daily routines, unaware that something was stirring beneath their feet. Dr. Chun in her clinic, checking equipment that had begun malfunctioning for no apparent reason. Martha in her library, surrounded by protective symbols she had spent decades learning to create. And in the darkest corners of the tunnel system, shapes that defied description were beginning to move. The vision faded, leaving Jake gasping on the stone floor. But the connection remained, a constant awareness of the town above and the presence below. The wound wasn't just a mark, it was a sensory organ, allowing him to perceive things that existed between dimensions. You're beginning to understand. Jake spun around to find a woman standing at the edge of the chamber, but not the edge he had entered from. She was perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair and intelligent eyes, wearing clothes that suggested she had been traveling rough. In her hands was a device that looked like a cross between a Geiger counter and a radio, its display showing readings that pulsed in rhythm with Jake's wound. "Who are you?" Jake managed to ask. "Elena Vasquez. I'm what you might call a specialist in dimensional anomalies." She approached the circle carefully, her device clicking rapidly. "I've been tracking disturbances in this area for the past 6 months. The readings have been getting stronger, particularly in the last few days. Since I came back to town." "Exactly." Elena knelt beside the ritual circle, studying the symbols with practiced eyes. "You're the anchor they've been waiting for, aren't you? The living bridge between worlds." Jake nodded, too exhausted to maintain pretenses. "My grandfather was the first." But the ritual was never completed. Until now. Elena's expression was grim. "Jake, I need you to understand something. What happened to your grandfather? What's happening to you? It's not unique. I've tracked similar cases across the country. There are people like you in Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, all descendants of families who made deals with entities that exist outside our normal reality." She showed him photographs on a tablet of other ritual sites, other marked individuals, other towns where the barriers between worlds had been weakened. The thing is, most of them don't survive the activation process. The mark grows until it consumes them completely, and they become permanent doorways for things that shouldn't exist in our world. Jake looked down at his leg, where the dark veins had now spread halfway to his knee. "How long do I have? Based on the progression rate I'm seeing? Days, maybe a week before the transformation becomes irreversible." Elena stood, her device still clicking ominously. But there might be another way. She pulled out a second journal, this one modern and filled with her own research notes. "I've been studying the entities that create these marks, trying to understand what they want and how they operate. They're not just randomly choosing victims, they're building a network, a series of connected anchors that will allow them to establish permanent footholds in our reality." "A network," Jake repeated, understanding dawning. "The other marked people were all connected." "Precisely. And if my calculations are correct, when enough anchors reach full activation simultaneously, they'll be able to open a doorway large, enough for their entire civilization to cross over." The implications hit Jake like an avalanche. How many anchors do they need? Elena's expression was answer enough. "We think you might be the last one." Elena's research files painted a picture more terrifying than anything Jake had imagined. Spread across her tablet were case studies from 17 different sites across the American West, each documenting families marked by supernatural entities. each anchor growing stronger as Jake's own condition progressed. The timeline is accelerating, Elena explained as they sat in the eerie glow of the ritual chamber. 6 months ago, the marked individuals were experiencing minor symptoms, occasional visions, unexplained pain. 3 months ago, the physical manifestations began. Now they're all reaching critical mass simultaneously. Jake studied the photographs of other anchors. A woman in Colorado whose arm had become a writhing mass of dark veins. A man in Utah whose eyes had turned completely black. A teenager in New Mexico who had stopped eating, claiming she could survive on energy from the space between worlds. What happened to them? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. The woman in Colorado disappeared 2 weeks ago. Local authorities found her house empty, but neighbors reported seeing strange lights in the basement for 3 days straight. The man in Utah, Elena paused, her voice catching. He opened a doorway in his barn. The entire structure collapsed into itself, creating a crater that goes down farther than any geological survey equipment can measure. And the girl? Maria Santos. She's the reason I came here. 3 days ago, she sent me a message through channels. That shouldn't be possible, a psychic communication that reached me across 800 miles. She said the others were calling to her, that they were ready to begin the final convergence. Jake felt the womb pulse with recognition. I can feel them too. When the visions come, I see through their eyes sometimes. They're all connected to this place, aren't they? Elena nodded grimly. This mine is the original site, the first successful dimensional breach. All the other locations are satellites, connected through a network that spans multiple states. But Cedar Ridge is the hub, the central anchor point that will coordinate the final opening. She showed him a map marked with red dots across Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. Lines connected each dot to Cedar Ridge, forming a pattern that looked disturbingly organic, like a nervous system with the McAllister mine as its brain. The entities behind this aren't random monsters, Elena continued. They're organized, intelligent, and they've been planning this incursion for nearly a century. The mining companies, the occult consultants, even the specific families they targeted, it was all part of a larger design. Jake stood and walked to the edge of the ritual circle, feeling the pull of the symbols carved into stone. What do they want? Why go to all this trouble to enter our world? From what I've been able to determine, their dimension is dying. The energy sources that sustain their civilization are depleting, and they need a new home. But they can't simply relocate. The physical laws of our universe are incompatible with their biology. They need to change our reality to match theirs. Change it how? Elena's expression was haunted. Have you noticed anything unusual about the town since you've been back? Small things, easily dismissed as coincidence? Jake thought about the past. Few days. Electronics malfunctioning. Dr. Chun mentioned equipment failures at the clinic. The library lights exploding. And the temperature, it's been unusually cold for this time of year. Those are the early signs. Reality is becoming more flexible around you, more susceptible to influence from their dimension. If the convergence succeeds, those changes will spread outward from Cedar Ridge in an expanding wave, rewriting the fundamental laws of physics across the entire continent. The implications made Jake's head spin. How many people would die? Everyone, Elena said simply. Not immediately, but inevitably. Humans can't survive in a reality structured according to their dimensional laws. We'd become extinct within a few generations, replaced by beings that can exist in both dimensions simultaneously. Jake sank to his knees as the full weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders. Not just his own life, but the survival of humanity itself hung in the balance. And he was the key that would either lock the door forever or throw it wide open. There has to be a way to stop it, he said desperately. If my grandfather survived the process, if the ritual can be interrupted, I've been researching that possibility, Elena admitted. The original interruption in 1935 was accidental, caused by the mine explosion. But there might be a way to deliberately disrupt the network. She pulled up another file on her tablet, technical diagrams that looked like a cross between engineering, schematics, and mystical mandalas. The anchor points are connected through what can best be described as dimensional resonance. Each marked individual acts as a tuning fork, vibrating at frequencies that thin the barriers between worlds. But if one anchor could be made to vibrate out of phase with the others, it would break the network. Jake finished, understanding dawning. The discordant frequency would cascade through the connections, disrupting all the other anchor points. Exactly. But there's a catch. Elena's voice was heavy with regret. The anchor that creates the disruption would have to be destroyed in the process. The resonance feedback would tear apart anyone at the center of the network collapse. Jake was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what she was suggesting. Save humanity by sacrificing himself. It should have been an easy choice. But the wound's influence made clear thinking nearly impossible. He could feel the entities calling to him from beyond the dimensional barrier, promising power, belonging, and an end to the pain that had defined his existence since childhood. How would it work? He asked finally. Elena showed him a device that looked like a modified tuning fork attached to electronic components. This is a resonance disruptor. If you could reach the center of the original ritual circle while connected to all the other anchors, the device would create a harmonic cascade that should collapse the entire network. Should? I won't lie to you, Jake. This is all theoretical. I've never seen it tested, and there's no guarantee it would work. You could die for nothing, and the convergence could proceed without you. Jake looked around the chamber that had shaped his family's destiny for 3 generations. The symbols seemed to pulse with anticipation, eager for him to take his place at the center of their design. But he thought about Dr. Chun's dedication to healing, Martha's fierce protection of the town's secrets, and his father's lifetime of silent sacrifice to keep this moment from arriving. If I do this, if I use the disruptor, what happens to the other anchors? If it works, they should be freed from the connection. The marks will become ordinary scars, and they can live normal lives. Elena paused. If it doesn't work, they'll complete their transformations and become permanent doorways. The wound flared with sudden pain, and Jake gasped as a new vision filled his mind. He could see the other anchors across the network, all 17 of them standing in their own ritual sites, their marks glowing with increasing intensity. They were calling to him, begging him to join them in the final convergence. The loneliness and pain would end, they promised. He would finally belong somewhere. But beneath their pleas, he sensed something else. Terror. Part of them was still human, still capable of understanding what they were becoming. They didn't want to be doorways for an alien invasion. They wanted to be saved. Jake made his decision. Show me how to use the device. Training with the resonance disruptor took most of the day, but Jake's connection to the network made the process both easier and more disturbing than Elena had expected. As his understanding of the device grew, so did his awareness of the other anchors and the entities waiting beyond the dimensional barrier. They climbed back to the surface as the sun was setting, Jake's wound now glowing visibly through his jeans. The dark veins had spread past his knee and were beginning to branch toward his hip. Elena's instruments confirmed what Jake could feel in his bones. The transformation was accelerating. We need to get back to town, Elena said, checking her readings. The resonance levels are spiking. I think the network is preparing for final convergence. But as they reached Jake's truck, they found Sheriff Tom Briggs waiting for them, his expression grim. The man Jake remembered as his childhood friend had grown weathered and cautious, his hair gray and his face lined with the weight of keeping Cedar Ridge's secrets. "Jake," Tom said with forced calm, "we need to talk." "Tom." Jake extended his hand, but the sheriff stepped back, his eyes fixed on a faint glow emanating from Jake's leg. "Dr. Chung called me. Said your condition was getting worse." Tom's hand rested on his service weapon, not threatening, but ready. "She also said you were asking about the mine." "He has a right to know the truth," Elena interjected. "About what happened to his grandfather, about what's happening to him." Tom studied Elena with professional suspicion. "And you are? Someone who might be able to help." Elena showed him her credentials, government identification that indicated she worked for an agency Jake had never heard of. "I specialize in cases like this." "Cases like what?" Instead of answering, Elena showed Tom the readings on her device. The sheriff's face went pale as he saw the energy levels surrounding Jake. "How long?" Tom asked quietly. "Based on the progression rate, maybe 12 hours before he reaches critical mass," Elena replied. "Maybe less." Tom was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between Jake and the mine entrance. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "Your father made me promise to tell you something if this day ever came," he said to Jake. "About the night we found you in the mine." Jake waited, sensing that this revelation would change everything. "We weren't alone down there," Tom continued. "When we reached the ritual chamber, you were lying in the center of that circle, unconscious, and glowing just like you are now. But around the edges of the chamber, in the shadows, there were things. Shapes that moved like liquid shadow, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's." The memory hit Jake like a physical blow. He could suddenly recall lying in the circle, feeling something vast and alien pressing against his consciousness, trying to merge with his mind. The shapes Tom described had been reaching for him with tendrils of living darkness. "They were trying to complete the transformation," Jake whispered. "Turn me into a permanent doorway." "Your father shut out the electrical cables powering their equipment." The lights went out, and in the darkness, we heard. Tom paused, gathering courage. "We heard screaming, not human screaming." The things in the shadows were being pulled back, sucked into cracks in the rock that sealed themselves behind them. Elena checked her instruments again, frowning at the readings. The interruption severed their connection temporarily, but it didn't destroy it. They've been waiting for Jake to mature, to reach the age where the transformation could be completed. 42, Jake said, understanding. "The same age my grandfather would have been if he'd lived. The entities don't experience time the way we do," Elena explained. "To them, the 70 years since the original ritual is barely a moment. They've been patient because they knew eventually their anchor would return." Tom stepped closer, his expression haunted. "Jake, there's something else. The night your father died, it wasn't a heart attack." The words hit Jake like ice water. "What do you mean?" "Dr. Chung covered it up at my request. Your father's body showed signs of extreme hypothermia, even though he was found inside the house on a warm evening. And there were marks on his skin symbols that looked burned into the flesh." Jake felt the wound pulse with sudden intensity. "They killed him. We think they were trying to prevent him from warning you," Tom said. "Robert had been preparing for this day since you left town. He'd gathered information, made plans. He was going to find a way to break the pact and free you from the curse." Elena's device began beeping urgently. "We need to move. The energy readings are spiking beyond anything I've recorded." As if summoned by her words, the temperature around them plummeted. Their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air, and the electronic equipment in Tom's patrol car began malfunctioning. In the distance, the lights of Cedar Ridge flickered like candles in a hurricane. "It's starting," Jake said, feeling the pull of the mine intensify. The entities were no longer content to wait. They were actively drawing him back to complete what they had started 70 years ago. Tom drew his weapon, though Jake could see the futility in his eyes. I won't let them take you without a fight. Your bullets can't hurt them, Elena said urgently. But there might be another way. Jake, the binding circle in the mine, it's not just a summoning tool. It's also a focal point for dimensional energy. If we could modify the resonance disruptor to work within the circle itself, use their own power against them, Jake finished. But I'd have to get to the center of the circle voluntarily. They'll think I'm surrendering to the transformation. The wound was now blazing with light, and Jake could feel his consciousness being pulled in 17 different directions at once. Through the network, he experienced the final moments of the other anchors. The woman in Colorado was standing in her basement, her entire arm now transformed into writhing shadow. The man in Utah was descending into the crater where his barn had been, his body more energy than flesh. The girl in New Mexico was rising into the air, supported by forces that defied gravity. They're all converging simultaneously, Jake gasped. In about an hour, every anchor point will reach critical mass at the same time. Elena grabbed his shoulder, her eyes fierce with determination. Then we end this now. Tom, we need to get to the mine. The whole town will be in danger if this goes wrong, Tom warned. The whole world will be in danger if we do nothing, Elena replied Dodd as they drove toward the mine. Jake felt the last of his resistance crumbling. The entity's call was becoming impossible to ignore, their promises of power and belonging overwhelming his human thoughts. But in the depths of his mind, his father's words from the journal echoed, "Everything I did was to protect you." Robert Dunley had sacrificed his life to give Jake this chance. Now it was time to discover if love and sacrifice could triumph over cosmic horror, or if the Dunley family's century-long curse would finally claim its due. They reached the mine entrance as the last light faded from the sky. The temperature had dropped another 20 degrees, and ice was forming on the rocks despite the late spring date. Elena's instruments were screaming warnings, their displays showing energy readings that should have been impossible. But it was Martha Calloway waiting for them at the mine entrance that made Jake's blood run cold. The elderly librarian stood perfectly still in the freezing air, her silver hair whipping in an unnatural wind that seemed to emanate from the mine itself. "Mrs. Calloway," Jake called out, stepping from the truck. "You shouldn't be here. It's not safe." Martha turned to face them, and Jake saw that her eyes had become completely black, not the white showing, just endless darkness that seemed to reflect the starlight. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "Jacob Samuel Dunley," she said, the words echoing from multiple directions simultaneously. "You have returned to fulfill your destiny." Tom drew his weapon, but Elena placed a restraining hand on his arm. "That's not Martha anymore," she said quietly. "She's been compromised by the network." "How long?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I suspect much longer than any of us realized," Elena replied, studying Martha's transformed features. "The entities needed someone close to your family, someone who could guide events and ensure you would eventually return." Martha, or the thing wearing her form, smiled with predatory satisfaction. 70 years I have watched over this town, protecting its secrets, waiting for this moment. Did you really think an old woman could resist forces that span dimensions?" The revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. Every conversation with Martha, every document she had shown him, every piece of information about his family's history, it had all been carefully orchestrated to bring him to this moment. "The mining records," he said, understanding dawning. "The packed document. You've been feeding me exactly what I needed to know to make the right choices." "The truth is often the most effective lie," Martha agreed. "You needed to understand your heritage, to feel the weight of responsibility. Free will is so much more satisfying than simple compulsion." Tom kept his weapon trained on Martha, though his hands were shaking. How long has she been one of them? Since the night your grandfather disappeared, Martha replied, her black eyes fixed on Jake. I was just a young woman then, working at the library. When the entities needed a long-term guardian for their investment, they chose someone who would be trusted, someone who could guide events across generations. Elena's device was beeping frantically now, and she looked up from its display with growing alarm. Jake, we have a bigger problem. According to these readings, Martha isn't just compromised, she's another anchor point. The network doesn't have 17 anchors, it has 18. The implications crashed over Jake like an avalanche. She's been connected to the network from the beginning. That's how they knew exactly when to accelerate the timeline, exactly how to manipulate events. And more than that, Elena continued, her voice tight with fear. If Martha is the original anchor, the one established in 1935, then she's not just part of the network, she's been controlling it. Martha laughed, a sound like wind through broken glass. Such clever children. Yes, I am the first, the eldest, the one who opened the initial doorway that allowed my kind to begin this grand design. Your grandfather's ritual was never meant to transform him, it was meant to strengthen me. The temperature plummeted further, and Jake could see his breath forming ice crystals in the air. Around them, the very fabric of reality seemed to be buckling under the weight of forces that shouldn't exist in their dimension. But there's something you didn't account for, Jake said, fighting through the pain as his wound blazed with increasing intensity. Elena's disruption device. If you're the original anchor, then destroying you would collapse the entire network. Would it? Martha asked, tilting her head with inhuman precision. Tell me, Jacob, what makes you think you're still fully human? The question hit him like ice water. What do you mean? Martha gestured toward Elena, whose face had gone pale as she stared at her instruments. Show him the readings, my dear. Show him what you discovered about his blood composition. Elena's hands trembled as she turned the device toward Jake. The display showed analysis results that made no sense. His blood contained cellular structures that weren't entirely terrestrial, genetic markers that suggested he was only partially human. That's impossible, Tom said, but his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Martha asked. Did you never wonder why you survived the ritual when no other anchor has? Why your connection to the network is so much stronger than the others? Jake felt the world tilting around him as the truth became clear. I'm not my father's son. Biologically, no. You are the offspring of the previous attempt. The child born from a successful merging of human and entity genetics 42 years ago. Martha's smile was terrible in its satisfaction. The couple you knew as parents found you as an infant and raised you as their own, not knowing what you truly were. Elena's device confirmed what Martha was revealing. Jake's genetic structure was a hybrid of human DNA and something that existed outside normal biological classification. The wound wasn't a mark of curse or connection. It was his true nature manifesting as he reached full maturity. The entities you've been fighting aren't trying to possess you, Martha continued. They're trying to awaken you to your real identity. You are our advanced scout, our bridge builder, our most precious child finally coming home. Jake staggered backward, his entire understanding of himself crumbling. Every memory of his childhood, every moment of love and belonging with his adoptive parents, it was all built on a fundamental lie about his very nature. The other anchors, he whispered. They're not victims, they're my siblings. In a sense. Yes, each one a hybrid like yourself, though none as perfectly balanced between the dimensions as you. Martha stepped closer, her black eyes reflecting starlight that came from no earthly source. You can feel them calling to you, can't you? Your true family, waiting for you to embrace your heritage and lead them home. The pull Jake had been fighting suddenly made terrible sense. It wasn't external compulsion, it was his own nature calling him back to where he belonged. The pain he had carried all his life, the sense of never quite fitting in anywhere. The wound that marked him as different. It was all because he had been trying to live as something he wasn't. "But you have a choice," Martha said, her voice becoming almost gentle. "You can continue fighting your nature, continue the pain and isolation you've known all your life. Or you can accept what you are and help your people find the home they've been seeking for so long." Tom raised his weapon higher, but Jake could see the despair in his friend's eyes. "How do you fight something that might be right? How do you save someone who might not need saving?" Elena stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. "Jake, even if what she's saying is true, even if you're genetically part entity, you're still the person who chose to help me, who chose to try to save the other anchors. Your nature doesn't define your choices." But as Jake looked into Martha's eyes, he saw something that shattered his resolve completely. Genuine love. Not the manipulative affection of a handler for their asset, but the deep, abiding love of a mother for her child who had finally come home. For the first time in his life, Jake truly belonged somewhere. The question was whether belonging was worth the price of humanity's survival. The revelation of his true nature left Jake reeling, but there was no time to process the implications. Through the network connection, he could feel the other anchors reaching critical mass across 4 states. The woman in Colorado had become a pillar of living shadow, her basement transformed into a dimensional gateway. The man in Utah was descending into the crater that had replaced his barn, his body more energy than matter. The girl in New Mexico floated 20 feet above the ground, surrounded by geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly. "You have perhaps 30 minutes before the convergence becomes irreversible," Martha said, her black eyes reflecting the aurora-like lights that had begun dancing across the Wyoming sky. "But why fight it, my child? Why choose pain and isolation when you could have purpose and belonging?" Jake looked at Elena, whose instruments were screaming warnings about dimensional instability. Reality was becoming increasingly flexible around them. Shadows moved independently of their sources. Temperatures fluctuated wildly, and the very air shimmered with potential energy. "If I go through with the convergence," Jake asked Martha, "what happens to the humans? To people like Tom and Elena?" "They will be transformed," Martha replied without hesitation. "Over time, their reality will be reshaped to accommodate our needs. Some will adapt and survive in the new paradigm. Others will not. That's genocide," Elena said flatly. "That's evolution," Martha corrected. "Your species has had its time. Now it's our turn to inherit the earth." But Jake was studying Martha's expression, looking for the towels he remembered from his childhood. Even transformed, she retained some of the mannerisms that had made her trustworthy to 3 generations of Cedar Ridge residents. "You're not telling me everything," he said. "What aren't you saying about the transformation process?" Martha's smile faltered slightly. "The transition will be challenging for some individuals." "How challenging?" "The reshaping of reality requires considerable energy input," Martha admitted reluctantly. "The life force of existing inhabitants will provide the necessary power for the dimensional stabilization." Elena stepped forward, her voice deadly quiet. "You're going to drain the life from every human on Earth to power your invasion." "Not every human," Martha protested. "Perhaps 60 to 70%. The remainder will be preserved as a breeding population to maintain the hybrid programs." The casual way she discussed the death of billions made Jake's stomach turn. This wasn't evolution. It was extermination on a scale that defied comprehension. And he was the key that would unlock the door for humanity's destroyers. Tom lowered his weapon, his face gray with despair. "Jake, I've known you since you were 8 years old. I've watched you grow up, seen the man you became. Whatever your genetics say, whatever these things claim about your nature, you're still the boy who cried when we had to put down Old Blue because his leg was broken. You're still the man who spent his last $20 on groceries for the Hendricks family when their father lost his job. Jake felt tears burning his eyes as memories flooded back, not the alien visions that had been plaguing him, but genuine human moments. Teaching Sunday school at the Methodist church when he was 16, helping neighbors during blizzards. The way his father's face had lit up whenever Jake called from Montana. Your parents, your adoptive parents, they loved you exactly as you were, Tom continued. They never cared where you came from or what you might become. To them, you were just their son, and your father died protecting that love. The wound in Jake's leg pulsed with increasing intensity, but for the first time since returning to Cedar Ridge, he felt something stronger than the alien pull. He felt the weight of human connection, the bonds forged through choice rather than genetics. Elena, he said, his voice gaining strength. The resonance disruptor, can it be modified to target the original anchor instead of just disrupting the network? Elena's eyes widened as she understood his meaning. If we could overload Martha's connection to the network, the feedback might not just collapse the system. It might reverse the process entirely. Impossible, Martha said, but Jake caught a note of uncertainty in her voice. The network has been building for 70 years. It cannot simply be undone. Maybe not, Jake admitted, but we can try. He started walking toward the mine entrance, feeling the pull intensify with each step. Behind him, Elena quickly modified the resonance disruptor while Tom kept his weapon trained on Martha. You don't understand what you're attempting, Martha called after him. Even if you succeed in disrupting the network, you'll still be what you are, a hybrid caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Jake paused at the mine entrance. Maybe that's exactly what I need to be. The descent into the mine felt different this time. The phosphorescent veins in the walls pulsed in rhythm with Jake's wound, and he could feel the entity side of his nature growing stronger with each step downward. But he also felt the human connections that had shaped him, his father's patient teaching, Tom's loyal friendship, Dr. Chun's compassionate care, and even Martha's decades of guidance. However misguided her ultimate purpose, Elena and Tom followed. Close behind, their flashlight beams cutting through air that shimmered with dimensional energy. Martha brought up the rear, no longer bothering to maintain her human facade. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, and patterns of light moved beneath its surface like living circuitry. The chamber is different, Elena observed as they approached the ritual site. She was right. The circular chamber had expanded beyond its original dimensions, and the carved symbols around the ritual circle now extended up the walls and across the ceiling in fractal patterns that seemed to extend into impossible geometries. At the center of the circle, a pillar of swirling energy rose from floor to ceiling, crackling with forces that belonged to no earthly physics. The convergence field, Martha explained. As the network reaches critical mass, it creates a stabilized pathway between dimensions. All that remains is for you to take your place at the center, my child. Through the network connection, Jake could feel the other anchors reaching their final transformations. The woman in Colorado had become a permanent gateway, with shapes moving through her transformed body from the other dimension. The man in Utah was descending into depths that existed outside normal space. The girl in New Mexico was ascending into geometries that couldn't be mapped on any human chart. They're all converging on the same moment, Jake said, feeling the synchronization pulling at his consciousness. In about 10 minutes, every anchor point will activate simultaneously. Elena finished modifying the disruptor and handed it to Jake. This should create a resonance cascade that flows backward through the network to Martha's original connection. But Jake, I know, he said quietly. If this works, I might not survive the feedback. And if it doesn't work, the convergence proceeds and humanity dies anyway. Elena's voice was steady, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. The choice is yours. Jake looked around the chamber that had shaped his family's destiny for 3 generations. His grandfather had stood in this same circle, facing the same impossible choice between humanity and belonging. But Timothy Dunley had been given no real option. The ritual had been forced upon him by men who saw him as nothing more than raw material for their experiments. Jake had a choice. And perhaps that choice was what made him truly human, regardless of his genetics. "Tom," he said, turning to his oldest friend, "if I don't make it out of this, I want you to know having you and your father believe in me all those years, it meant everything." Tom nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You've got this, Jake. You always were the toughest kid in Cedar Ridge." Elena checked her instruments one final time. The convergence begins in 90 seconds. Once you activate the disruptor, there's no going back. Jake stepped into the ritual circle, feeling the energy pillar respond to his presence. The symbols carved into the stone began to glow, and he could sense Martha's satisfaction as he approached what she believed was his surrender. But as Jake reached the center of the circle, he thought about his father's final words in the journal. "Everything I did was to protect you." Robert Dunley had spent his entire life preparing Jake for this moment, not to fulfill an alien destiny, but to have the strength to reject it. Jake activated the resonance disruptor, and the chamber filled with a harmonic frequency that seemed to shake the foundations of reality itself. The moment Jake activated the resonance disruptor, the chamber exploded with competing frequencies. The device in his hands vibrated so intensely that he could barely maintain his grip, while the symbols carved into the walls flared with blinding light. But instead of the clean disruption Elena had predicted, the conflicting energies created a chaos that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of space. Martha's scream of rage echoed from multiple dimensions simultaneously as she realized what Jake was attempting. Her carefully maintained human facade shattered completely, revealing the entity that had been wearing her form for 70 years. She became a writhing mass of shadow and light, her consciousness expanding beyond the confines of physical form, as she fought to maintain control of the network. "You don't understand what you're destroying." Martha's voice came from everywhere at once. "Without guidance, the convergence will become unstable. You'll kill every anchor across 4 states." But Jake could feel through the network that Martha was lying. The other anchors weren't dying. They were being freed. The woman in Colorado collapsed to solid ground as the gateway in her basement sealed itself. The man in Utah found himself standing on stable earth as the crater filled itself in. The girl in New Mexico settled gently to the ground as the alien geometries faded around her. The problem was that the energy had to go somewhere, and it was all flowing back through the network toward the original anchor point, toward Martha, and toward Jake at the center of the ritual circle. Elena's instruments exploded in showers of sparks as the resonance cascade built beyond anything they could measure. Tom raised his weapon toward Martha's transformed shape, but bullets passed harmlessly through her shifting form without effect. "Jake, the feedback is getting too strong," Elena shouted over the increasing harmonic roar. "The disruptor can't handle this much energy." Jake could feel it too. The device in his hands was heating up rapidly, its components beginning to fail under the stress of channeling forces it was never designed to contain. But he could also feel something else through his hybrid nature, the terror of the entities on the other side of the dimensional barrier as their carefully laid plans crumbled. They had spent centuries preparing for this invasion, seeding anchor points across multiple continents, manipulating human bloodlines to create the perfect hybrid bridges. Now it was all collapsing because one of their own children had chosen humanity over heritage. The energy pillar at the center of the circle began to destabilize, its swirling patterns becoming chaotic as competing forces tore at its structure. Jake realized with growing alarm that Elena was right. The disruptor was designed to create a controlled collapse, not handle the raw power of 18 anchor points feeding back through a single focal point. There's too much energy, he called out. The device is going to overload. Martha's transformed shape writhed with fury as she fought to regain control of the cascade. You foolish child. You're going to destroy us all. But even as she spoke, Jake could see the protective ward network that had guarded Cedar Ridge for generations beginning to activate. Hidden symbols carved into buildings throughout the town began to glow with defensive energy, and he realized that his father and others had spent decades preparing for this moment. Tom suddenly understood what was happening. The wards! Jake, the town's protection grid is responding to the energy surge. Your father must have connected it to the mine somehow. Elena looked up from her ruined instruments with sudden hope. If the ward network can channel the excess energy distributed across the entire town instead of concentrating it here, the possibility hit Jake like lightning. His father hadn't just been hiding from the entities all these years. He had been building a trap. The ward network wasn't just defensive. It was designed to contain and redirect the very forces that powered the dimensional breach. But using the wards would require Jake to open himself fully to the network, to become a conduit for energies that would likely destroy his human consciousness entirely. He would save the anchors and stop the invasion, but he might not survive as the person he had been. Through the chaos, Jake heard Tom shouting something about the townspeople. Even at this distance from Cedar Ridge, they could see lights throughout the community flickering in rhythm with the energy cascade. People were waking up, coming outside, drawn by forces they couldn't understand. They're in danger, Jake realized. If the energy surge reaches the town while people are outside, the ward network will protect them, Elena said, though her voice carried uncertainty. Your father designed it to shield the entire community, but Jake could feel through his connection to the ritual circle that the protection would come at a cost. Someone had to serve as the focal point for the ward network, a human anchor to guide the alien energies safely into containment. And there was only one person in Cedar Ridge who had the hybrid nature necessary to survive such a role. The resonance disruptor was failing rapidly now, its housing cracking from the heat and stress. Jake had perhaps 30 seconds before it disintegrated entirely, releasing all the contained energy in an uncontrolled explosion that would level half the county. Martha seemed to sense his growing understanding. Yes, she hissed. You see it now, don't you? There is no victory here, only the choice of how you wish to die. Embrace your nature and live as our bridge between worlds, or sacrifice yourself for a species that will never truly accept you. Jake looked at Tom and Elena, both of them risking their lives to help him save a world that neither of them fully understood. He thought about Dr. Chun, who had spent her career healing people without thought of reward, about the townspeople of Cedar Ridge, who had lived with the knowledge of supernatural threats for generations and had chosen to protect rather than exploit that knowledge. Maybe acceptance isn't the point, Jake said, his voice cutting through the chaos. Maybe what matters is choosing to protect something bigger than yourself. He made his decision, opening his consciousness fully to both the failing disruptor and the awakening ward network. The dual connection sent waves of agony through his body as human and alien energies fought for dominance in his hybrid physiology. But beneath the pain, he felt something else, the love and sacrifice of everyone who had ever protected him. From his adoptive parents to his childhood friends to the townspeople who had kept dangerous secrets rather than abandon their home. That love gave him the strength to hold on as reality bent around him, to serve as the bridge not between dimensions, but between destruction and salvation. The moment Jake opened himself to both the disruptor and the ward network, the world exploded into chaos and clarity simultaneously. Through his hybrid consciousness, He could perceive reality from multiple perspectives at once. The chamber. Around him, the town of Cedar Ridge 3 miles away, and the dimensional space where the entities writhed in frustration as their invasion collapsed. But it was the sound of his father's pocket watch that anchored him to his humanity. In the midst of the energy storm, Tom had pulled the antique timepiece from his pocket. Robert Dunley had asked him to give it to Jake if this day ever came. The steady tick-tick of its mechanism cut through the alien harmonics like a lifeline, reminding Jake of quiet evenings on the ranch porch, learning to rope cattle and a father's patient love. Hold on to that sound. Elena shouted, though. She could barely be heard over the resonance cascade. Don't let the entity consciousness overwhelm you. Jake gripped the disruptor with both hands as its housing began to crack and split. The device was seconds from catastrophic failure, but the ward network was responding, drawing energy away from the mine and distributing it across dozens of protective symbols throughout Cedar Ridge. He could feel the townspeople stirring in their beds as ancient safeguards activated, but the wards were holding, keeping the supernatural energies contained. Martha's transformed shape writhed in the center of the chamber, her connection to the original anchor point making her the focal point for 70 years of accumulated dimensional pressure. "You cannot banish us," she screamed. "We are part of this world now. Part of you." "You're right," Jake said, his voice carrying both human determination and entity understanding. "You are part of me, which means I can choose what to do with that connection." Instead of fighting the alien aspects of his nature, Jake embraced them, but on his own terms. He used his entity heritage to understand the dimensional energies flowing through the chamber and his human heart to guide those energies toward protection rather than destruction. The resonance cascade began to stabilize as Jake imposed his will on forces that had seemed beyond control. Through the network connection, he felt the other anchors across 4 states as their transformations reversed completely. The woman in Colorado found herself fully human again. Her basement returned to normal. The man in Utah stood in his rebuilt barn, confused but whole. The girl in New Mexico landed safely in her backyard, her family rushing out to embrace her. But the effort of channeling such massive energies was destroying Jake's physical form. He could feel his human body beginning to break down under the stress, his consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone. Through the pocket watch's steady rhythm, he heard Tom calling his name, but the voice seemed to come from very far away. "Jake, stay with us." Alana's voice cut through the dimensional static. "The cascade is stabilizing. You're winning." Winning. The word seemed strange in a situation where victory meant sacrifice. But as Jake felt Martha's control over the network finally shatter, as the entities on the other side of the dimensional barrier were pulled back into their dying realm, he understood that this was indeed victory, not just for humanity, but for the principle that love and choice could triumph over genetic destiny. The resonance disruptor finally disintegrated in his hands, its components scattering across the chamber floor. But the ward network had taken over, channeling the last of the dimensional energies into harmless dissipation. The symbols on the walls began to fade. The energy pillar collapsed, and the chamber returned to being just a cave carved from ordinary stone. Martha's entity form wavered and began to dissolve as her connection to the network severed completely. But as she faded, Jake saw something unexpected in her expression. Not rage or hatred, but relief. The real Martha Kellaway, buried beneath 70 years of alien influence, had been fighting the entity's control all along. "Thank you," she whispered with her own voice, finally free. "Thank you for giving me back my choice." Jake collapsed to his knees as the last of the dimensional energies drained away. The wound on his leg, which had defined his existence for 30 years, was finally beginning to close. The dark veins that had spread up his thigh were fading, leaving only ordinary human skin. but the effort of serving as a bridge between destruction and salvation had left him, barely conscious. Tom and Elena rushed to his side as the chamber stabilized around them. The supernatural cold lifted, the impossible geometries reverted to normal stone, and the phosphorescent glow faded to darkness broken only by their flashlights. "Is it over?" Tom asked, checking Jake for injuries. Elena consulted the one device that had survived the energy surge, simple electromagnetic detector that showed normal readings for the first time since she had arrived in Cedar Ridge. "The dimensional barrier is stable. The network is collapsed. And according to my contacts, all the other anchor sites have returned to normal." Jake managed a weak smile, though his vision was blurring from exhaustion. "The other anchors, are they?" "Okay. More than okay," Elena replied. "They're free. Fully human, with no trace of entity influence. You gave them back their lives." As Tom helped Jake to his feet, they heard sounds from the tunnel entrance voices calling their names. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge, drawn by the ward networks. Activation had come to ensure their protectors had survived the final confrontation. Jake leaned heavily on Tom's shoulder as they made their way toward the surface, toward the community that had shaped him and the life he had chosen to preserve. The wound that had marked him as different was healing at last, but the scars it left behind would always remind him of the price of belonging and the greater value of love freely given and received. 3 months later, Jake stood on the front porch of the ranch house, watching the sun rise over the Bighorn Mountains. The coffee in his hand steamed in the crisp morning air, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear cattle lowing as they moved toward the water tank. Normal sounds of a normal ranch on a normal Wyoming morning. He rolled up his jeans and looked at his left leg. Where the wound had pulsed and spread for 30 years, only a small, ordinary scar remained pale and smooth, no different from any mark left by childhood injury. Dr. Chen had examined it extensively during his recovery, marveling at how completely the alien tissue had been replaced by normal human cells. "Still checking to make sure it's really gone?" Tom asked, climbing the porch steps with his own cup of coffee. "Hard to believe sometimes," Jake admitted. 30 years of carrying that mark, of feeling different and disconnected. "Now it's just a scar," Tom finished. "Like any other. Reminder of something that happened long ago." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the day begin. Tom had taken early retirement from the sheriff's department, claiming he wanted to help Jake rebuild the ranch. But Jake knew his old friend simply wanted to stay close, to ensure that the man he'd helped save remained anchored to his humanity. Dr. Chen emerged from the house, medical bag in hand. She'd been staying at the ranch during Jake's recovery, initially as his physician, but increasingly as something more. The shared experience of facing cosmic horror had created bonds deeper than either had expected. "Your vitals are completely normal," she announced, though she still insisted on daily checkups. Heart rate, blood pressure, even the unusual cellular markers Elena detected. Everything reads fully human. "No trace of entity genetics?" Jake asked, though he knew the answer. "None. Whatever you did in that chamber, it didn't just break the network, it completed your transformation back to baseline human." Sarah settled into the porch swing beside him. "Elena thinks the resonance cascade acted like a genetic reset, purging the alien elements from your DNA." Elena had stayed in touch, updating them on the other anchor's recovery. The woman in Colorado had returned to her job as a schoolteacher, with no memory of her transformation. The man in Utah was rebuilding his barn, occasionally puzzled by dreams of impossible geometries, but otherwise unchanged. The girl in New Mexico had started college early, a brief exposure to expanded consciousness apparently enhancing her natural intelligence. "They're all living normal lives," Jake mused. "No supernatural abilities, no dimensional awareness. Just ordinary people who survive something extraordinary. Is that what you wanted? Sarah asked gently. To be ordinary? Jake considered the question as he watched a hawk circle overhead, hunting for prey in the morning light. During his recovery, he'd had time to think about identity and belonging, about the difference between heritage and choice. I spent my whole life feeling like I didn't fit anywhere, he said finally. Too marked to be fully human, too human to understand what marked me. But maybe that feeling of not quite belonging anywhere is more human than I realized. Maybe it's what drives us to create belonging with family, with community, with people who choose to love us despite our differences. Tom raised his coffee, cup and a toast, to choosing your own family, and to second chances, Sarah added, and to fathers who love their children enough to prepare them for impossible choices. Jake finished, thinking of Robert Dunley's journal and the protective ward network that had made salvation possible. They were interrupted by the sound of a car coming up the gravel drive. Elena climbed out of a rental sedan, looking more relaxed than Jake had ever seen her. Her government agency had classified the Cedar Ridge incident as a natural gas explosion, officially closing the case while quietly adding the town to a list of locations requiring periodic monitoring. How are you feeling? She asked Jake, pulling a small device from her pocket. Not the complex instrument she'd used before, but a simple electromagnetic detector. See for yourself, Jake said. Elena waved the device around him, nodding at the completely normal readings. Remarkable. I've never seen such a complete reversal of entity influence. What about the mine? Sarah asked. Sealed permanently. We used concrete, steel mesh, and some specialized materials that should prevent any future dimensional breaches. Elena pocketed the detector. But honestly, I don't think we need to worry. Whatever was down there is gone. The entities were pulled back to their own dimension when the network collapsed, and without anchor points, they can't return. Jake walked to the edge of the porch and looked toward the foothills where the McAllister mine lay buried beneath tons of concrete and steel. Sometimes, late at night, he thought he could still feel echoes of the connection, not the painful pull of alien influence, but the memory of touching something vast and ancient. But the echoes were fading, like the scar on his leg, becoming just another part of his history rather than a defining characteristic. What's next for you? Elena asked. Jake gestured toward the ranch, spreading out before them, hundreds of acres of grassland and rolling hills, bounded by mountains that had stood unchanged for millennia. I'm going to rebuild this place. Run cattle, maybe add some horses. Tom's going to help, and Sarah's thinking about opening a small practice in town. The simple life, Elena observed. The chosen life, Jake corrected. For the first time in 42 years, I get to decide who I want to be without any cosmic forces pulling me in different directions. Elena smiled. I think that's the most human thing anyone could want. As she drove away, Jake remained on the porch with Tom and Sarah, watching the sun climb higher into the vast Wyoming sky. In the distance, he could see the town of Cedar Ridge beginning its daily routine, people going to work, children walking to school, neighbors helping neighbors with the small tasks that make communities strong. It was ordinary. It was beautiful. It was exactly what he had fought to preserve. The scar on his leg would always remind him of the price of belonging, and the greater value of love, freely given and received. But more than that, it would remind him that sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do is choose to be human, not because of genetics or destiny, but because of the connections we forge and the sacrifices we make for those we've chosen to protect. Jake Dunley had finally found his place in the world, not as a bridge between dimensions, but as a man who understood that home isn't where you come from, it's what you're willing to fight for. And as he watched the sun rise over the land his family had worked for generations, he knew he was exactly where he belonged.